by Em and Justin. They are from Checker. Hey, you guys, how are you?
Hi, doing awesome.
So we have gotten a chance to know Em and Justin and learn a little bit about Checker. And I'm sure you guys have seen some stuff about it in the group, but maybe you guys introduce Checker, tell us a little bit about yourselves before we kind of get into what we're going to talk about today.
Justin, you kick us off.
Oh, okay, can do. Hi, my name is Justin. I manage our customer support engineering team here at Checker, but I'm also a fellow at the Denver Institute for Faith and Work, and care deeply just about the integration of grace and safety. So, really excited to be here and be able to talk about Checker.
Awesome. And my name is Emily, but I go by Em. I was talking to Abby earlier. A church that I attended back in Boston had about 20 Emilys, and so I stuck my claim to M, and so that's what I go by. But yeah, I work on our partnership team here at Checker, so I get to work with a lot of the church management platforms that Checker is integrated with to screen volunteers in lots of different faith communities across the United States. And so I am also a church attendee and longtime volunteer. So I've been through the screening process myself and definitely know what that's like. So can come with personal and professional experience to today's conversation.
Fantastic. Well, we are so glad to have you guys here. And like you said, this is a super important topic. I'm so glad that we're getting the chance to talk about it. So we're going to be discussing some of the best safety practices for volunteer ministries. And as we know, volunteers are the lifeblood of our organizations, of our churches, and without our volunteers, we would have a really difficult time carrying out our mission. But also, as I'm sure most of us are familiar with, it can be very difficult to retain a key volunteer, a strong volunteer base. But the good news is, and I didn't know this until you guys told me this earlier, if a team member is onboarded correctly, they are 69% more likely to stay with an organization. That is crazy. I had no idea. So today we're just going to cover some of the best practices for onboarding your staff and volunteers within your faith community. And so to get started, I want to ask you guys, it can be kind of tricky to balance security and safety along with the grace and understanding that we know in ministry. So if you guys could kind of talk about that delicate balance a little bit, I'd be really curious to hear about that.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we're kicking off the conversation with this part instead of the nuts and bolts of background checks, which isn't the most interesting element. It's an important element, but there are definitely some really key elements to consider whenever you're incorporating it into your overall trust and safety program within your volunteer organizations. A stat that we refer back to a lot is that 1 in 3 Americans has something on their criminal record, which is a lot. And another thing that we don't consider is how that disproportionately impacts people of color. And so there's something in our judicial system that we need to be aware of in terms of what goes on someone's record whenever they do have an infraction or they do have something that needs to go on in those record systems. But then having that element of consideration that it doesn't exclude someone from being able to serve or being able to be involved in community or included in volunteer opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, Em hit it right on the head, right? I mean, this is the conviction of the church. Like we're called to give empathy, forgiveness, and care as we welcome people into our ministries. And we want to understand people's past and their future. So we really think that at Checker, background checks can provide the almost impetus, if you will, to bring up that conversation about, hey, we're going to talk about your past, but we want to do that in a way that really acknowledges that, like, you're a human, I'm human, like, we are flawed, but we also understand, like, that there's so much grace, there's understanding, and there's a need for safety. And so let's have that conversation, just really balance out that we're going to find a place for you here. We want to welcome you into our community, and we want to hear about your past, your history. I think it's a super cool opportunity for the church to be able to engage people in some of the most painful, sometimes hurtful moments.
Yeah, I know that being able to talk about openly, not openly, but having the space in the forum for whenever you're reviewing background checks or looking at volunteer records to be able to openly discuss and say, hey, what's going on? And can you tell us a bit more about this experience and what happened? to provide more context, is also a really great opportunity for providing testimony and connection with individuals in your church. I know that having worked at Checker for a couple of years now and getting to attend conferences for some of our vendors and meeting customers, I've had so many stories where people have shared that somebody approached them and said, hey, I have something on my record, but this is how my life has turned around and this is how it's changed. And I want to be able to invest in a community that has helped with my growth and development. And so I think that's a really important aspect to consider. I'm not saying, and I don't think Justin would either, that this means that you have to let anyone, regardless of any charge, on your volunteer teams, and we can definitely talk more about those nuances, but just having that that open mindset of grace towards reviewing those elements is really important.
Yeah. One thing that we recommend for that exactly is to have a playbook ready to go for when it's these kind of charges, when it's this kind of situation. Like, this is what this is a transparent way to communicate what you can and cannot participate in, or what you want ministries that you're able to be a part of, or maybe like, hey, here's some places where we can go, or this is how the church will respond. Having that in place ahead of time makes those conversations way easier, so that you're not taken off guard by someone's past. You're able to go through a plan with them to understand exactly how to respond. Having a clear, transparent way makes it just so much easier for your volunteer leads or staff.
Yeah, just the final thing to kind of help make this a bit easier to actually put into practice, and something that we call the nature time nature check. So whenever you're looking at something on a background check report, looking at the nature of the offense and really understanding what does a charge mean. I was on another webinar earlier, and they were showing an example of something that looked really, really scary, but it was actually just rolling a stop sign.
Oh my goodness.
And I didn't realize that the actual what it would show up as on looks really, really terrifying. So just understanding the nature of whatever that conviction is, and digging into that, a quick Google search can help sometimes. Time, how long ago was the infraction? So if it's been several years, that's plenty of opportunity for growth and change and development. And then also the nature of the position that you're screening that volunteer for. So if you are doing a vacation Bible school where you've got somebody who's taking care of kids and driving buses, you're probably going to want to do a pretty thorough screen, because you're working with a sensitive population and minors, as well as an MVR, to be able to make sure you check their driving records. So those things all exist, and what should be considered whenever you're looking at a comprehensive background check.
Definitely. I think you guys have really given us a really great broad overview, and something that I have never even considered is, like you said, the opportunity to minister to people and to create that open environment, that vulnerability, and to really connect with the people who are going to be your volunteers, who maybe they are new members to your church, or maybe they've been there for a while. That is a really cool opportunity that I never even would have considered. And certainly the safety aspect is super important. I think that's a given. But maybe if you guys just want to kind of talk through why they're important, or maybe if some people listening they're not super familiar with why they need a background check, or even what a background check covers. Maybe just talk about the importance of that in ministry and why it's so imperative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really straightforward way of doing the bare minimum for your trust and safety program. It's a critical step and a very essential step to screen your volunteers, but it's not the one-stop shop. There's definitely a lot of other elements that go into screening and evaluating and onboarding people into your volunteer and ministry programs. So the background check component is just a very simple and straightforward way to kind of get that ball rolling when you're evaluating and screening individuals. Yeah.
And there's a few, I think, practical concerns that we often encourage organizations to look at, like liability. Background checks is a good thing to do to protect liability for your organization, right? As well, you want to show your congregation that they can trust that the people that are ministering to them, right?
Right.
I think that there's absolutely an element of I want to go to church and I want to make sure that when I am dropping off my kid, I don't have a kid, but if I did, right? Like that, to M's point, that this person that's watching them has been vetted, that the church has done their due diligence and is making sure that this person is equipped and is up to par, right?
Certainly, yeah.
Yeah, and it's definitely just a conversation starter. Like, I think to Justin's point earlier of having that playbook and being very transparent about your processes whenever it comes to onboarding volunteers, letting everybody know up front from the announcement stage at the pulpit of saying, hey, this is just part of our process. Everybody goes through this. If you have questions or things that you want to talk about, please reach out to so-and-so. And so just making that part of the overall process culture and just not something to be scared of, and actually something that can be more of a conversation starter for maybe an individual that does know something would come up and they want to be proactive about saying, like, what do I do in this situation and how can I work with you?
Yeah, totally agree.
Definitely. That definitely makes sense. And I think having the conversations from the pulpit and, like you said, not making anyone feel like they're going through something that maybe, they're being targeted for some specific reason, but that this is just like standard and everybody goes through it.
Yeah.
I know that one of the things that I don't think we talked about is that more churches are who their insurance providers are actually requiring that as part of being insured. And so sometimes it's not even part of, your own decision of your organization of whether or not you're going to do it. It's, hey, are we going to have an insurance policy for our organization and for this building and for, for what we're doing? And that's just a requirement of doing that.
Yeah. And I think Abby, you mentioned earlier, like maybe congregants who are already a part of your organization, maybe you've never implemented a background check like process before. And for whatever reason that is, maybe it's a small church and you just assume, everyone's history. But, we've heard cases where that's not true. You don't actually know everyone's history, right? And so there is something valuable of implementing this into your church, even if you haven't yet done background checks, and having these conversations from the pulpit, making sure that people understand why it's being done. Again, it's super important for all the reasons that we just mentioned, but also you don't always know everything about everyone in your congregation, and background checks are a great way to make sure that, like we said, you're protecting your congregation, you're equipping like volunteers with the information they need. It's invaluable to include no matter what stage of a church you are.
Definitely. And I think too, not changing people's minds, but just introducing the idea to people that this is standard and this is something we do in the regular world, right? Like to protect ourselves from liability and for our insurance policies. We do that in every other regard, every other part of our lives. So why would we not do it in ministry? I mean, it really is just being a good steward of our resources and taking care of making sure that all of our stuff is covered. That's super important. When it comes to actually integrating the background check process, so this is a little bit more of the nuts and bolts, a little more of the nitty gritty. How do maybe our volunteer managers, our ministry directors, how do they work to work that into the processes that already exist? Or as you said before, if a church for whatever reason doesn't have something in place, how should they go about that?
Yeah, I think that most of the churches that we work with access checker services through their church management platform. And we integrate with most of the major vendors. If you look at Checker's partner page, we have them listed, but popular ones are Tithely and Planning Center, PushPay, Rock RMS, Faith Teams. There's a growing number of them, but these are kind of core platforms that manage your volunteer or manage the contact records for your congregants, typically manage giving and things like that. And so it's a natural extension to want to start managing our volunteers and running background checks on them through those systems. So that's how a lot of people are engaging with us. If you don't already have a church management platform in place, that's okay. You can still start running checks and start incorporating these practices into whatever systems you have. My guess is if you don't have a church management platform, you probably have an Excel spreadsheet of everybody's contact information and columns of being able to say like, oh, I ran this check this and this date. You can go straight to Checker and sign up directly for an account and start running background checks on those volunteers straight from within our dashboard. if you're not doing that in another church management platform.
Yeah. And regardless of whether you're using a church management platform or you're using Checker directly, the process is super simple once you do have someone's email address. It's all you need to really run someone through what we call the invite flow at Checker. And so all you do is you put an email address in, and we send an email to that address that you provided to collect the volunteers' information. So their first name, their last name, Social Security. If you're running an MVR check, we'll get their driver's license number, all these things, right? So we take care of collecting all those fields directly from the volunteer, which is super helpful. I remember I've also obviously done some volunteer stuff, and when I've gone through the background check process, sometimes you have to provide like your last 3 addresses, and it's like, I don't know that.
Right.
Right. So Checker makes it really simple. It's really just your current address. It's very minimal. It's only the information that we need to really run the check that you're specifically wanting to run. We make sure that all the appropriate authorizations, disclosures, all the legal jargon is presented to the candidate when it needs to be, as it should be, to keep your ministry safe. And once we're done with that, we tell the volunteer, hey, the check is off and it's running. And actually, the volunteer can go to our candidate portal and see the status of their check. So it's a great way for everybody to be able to participate. So your volunteer leads, your own staff, but also the volunteer can see where they're at in the background check process.
That's super helpful. I too have volunteered at a lot of different organizations and in some different churches. And sometimes you get on and you're like, okay, I got to do my background check, got to do all my stuff. And then you're like, well, my goodness, they want me to sign my whole life away to them. Like, never mind, like I'm not going to volunteer. And I could see, some systems, I feel like that really is a barrier for people where they're like, this is too much of a commitment. This is too involved. Like, never mind. I'm not going to serve.
Yes.
Yes.
If I have to write down my social security number on a paper form that I give to a non-professional, and I'm like, I don't know what you're doing with that.
Yes, exactly. The security is not there. And I mean, we're getting more and more used to digital transactions and the whole digital world, obviously. And so again, why would we not try to be integrating that and making our processes more efficient in our churches?
Yeah. I think we see it as being a huge benefit for churches, not having to worry about that. And it takes the onus off of any one staff member or volunteer lead to be collecting that or doing all the nitty gritty, like, actually, you need to do this, and here's this disclosure.
Right.
So it's really the seamless piece of it's really useful.
And we also understand that in the church space, most of your volunteer coordinators or staff are not going to be HR professionals. Mm-hmm. They likely don't live in this world that for Checker, we know very well in terms of recruiting and screening and how that fits into hiring in the professional job realm. But we understand that you're not practitioners, you're not experts of this space, but volunteers are actually still categorized as unpaid employees. And so they need to be treated with the same kind of processes and legislation that you would during a pre-employment screening that you would for a job that you're applying for. So by using something like Checker, you're able to kind of have that peace of mind that the compliance elements are baked into our processes and that we have the necessary components that you might not be as familiar with since you're not an HR practitioner or somebody who's doing this regularly.
Definitely. And you guys really seem to take all of the guesswork out of it, all of the, like you said, these church communicators likely don't know all of this stuff. And so you guys are doing all the hard work for them. And two, I think it's important to highlight that it doesn't matter the size of the ministry. It doesn't matter the size of the church. The liability is still there regardless, right? And so maybe if you guys want to just kind of lightly touch on some of the important things that you will be protecting your church from simply by implementing this, super easy process.
Yeah, I think one thing that we would want to touch on is that Checker helps we give the records of what we find as a part of the background check, but we really try to simplify it down to a very clear wording, like clear or consider, to make it like, or pending. Like, I know pending doesn't seem like a really, complex thing, but sometimes you don't know what the status of the background check is.
Right.
So we try to make it very clear, one word statuses that give your, again, volunteers, staff leads, whoever's looking at the background check, the ability to see exactly where the check is. And if it's clear, hey, go on through. Some of the stuff that one of the products that we love to champion is our assess tooling, or our positive adjudication matrix tooling, which allows your church to set what sort of things are they interested in and for what time frame. There may be certain charges that simply you just don't really need to see, or you're not worried about. We can help do that for you automatically, so that charges that are irrelevant to a certain role that you're maybe trying to fill, or in your volunteer needs, or if there's a certain thing you never want to worry about. For example, we have a lot of people who don't really care about wildlife infractions. So someone who maybe accidentally shot a deer in a place that they shouldn't have, right? I mean, maybe maybe that's not great, but does it really prevent them from collecting for giving out communion? Maybe not, right? So we can help filter out those charges that just are not relevant, and that helps create a much smoother process for whoever's reviewing those background checks.
Yeah, we're also doing it at a great price point that is still accessible regardless of the size of your church. So we've standardized our pricing across all of our church partners so that we have a pre-discounted rate on our most popular packages. So if you're using us through a church management platform, those come pre-populated into your account with that discounted pricing already. I do like to caution people, though, especially I know it's a hard cost and it can seem appealing to choose the cheapest selection, but that's not always the best because it's not the most comprehensive in terms of the screens that you're running. So depending on the kind of role or volunteer position that you're screening for, you might be able to do something like a basic check, which could be $8 and does a quick database search. I think a good example of a volunteer position might be your hospitality person who's greeting people as they come in, or maybe a parking attendant who's just directing traffic. That's a super low touch, not really interacting with people in a sensitive way. But if you have somebody who is a childcare volunteer, you're going to want to run at least a standard, if not a pro package, so that you're doing a deeper search and making sure that you're gathering all the necessary information. And so being able to invest that upfront cost to have that peace of mind that somebody that is going to be interacting with these populations really helps mitigate the potential for liability later. And that's not to be used as a scare tactic or something that we're trying to say that this is a negative or bad thing, but just to be aware of that it is a necessary precaution to take. And it's better to do that, $8 to $30 check on each of your volunteers and be able to have that peace of mind up front.
Yeah, another role too that Emma's brought up in before in previous conversations is someone collecting the cash, right? Sorry.
Right.
Oh,
Collection, right? There's roles that just are more sensitive, dealing with more sensitive
of course, yeah.
work, right? So we also offer stuff like continuous check, which is a really cool product. We also created a continuous MBR product. So if you're wanting to, say, hey, we want to continually be looking out for new things that are coming up on someone's background check, maybe for those more sensitive positions, that's a product offering that you can access through Checker, which is super neat, very innovative way to keep up to touch 24/7 on what's happening with your candidate, your volunteers.
And I know that our audience today is certainly for the church space, but I know that we attend church and that we're in this space because we want to carry things out into the world. And so I just want to have everyone consider that things that you're learning and considering whenever you're looking at volunteers and inviting certain people in and learning more about individuals, you can carry that into your workplace, into the jobs that you're working, and maybe you're a hiring manager that looks over recruiting processes, and you can start looking at how to implement these kind of fair elements or the technology elements that Checker can provide in those other spaces. So just wanting to encourage people to carry that, the first topic that we talked about, that element of balancing safety and grace. doesn't exist just in our churches and our volunteer programs. It exists in our daily lives and in our professional lives too.
Absolutely. Yeah, it really is. And it definitely does. I mean, all across every element of our lives. If someone was interested in connecting with you guys, learning more about Checker, learning more about any of the points that we've talked about today, what would you recommend they do? Should they reach out to you? Should they visit a certain webpage? What would be the next step for someone who is like, I'm ready, I want to do this, we need this in our church, we needed this yesterday, what do we do?
I think my recommendation is definitely starting with, if you have a church management platform, if you're an admin in that system, visiting the integration page and seeing if you can connect an integration with Checker from that platform is probably the easiest, fastest way to integrate us into your existing processes. If you aren't using one of our integrated vendors, then we also have our direct site that you can just go create a Checker account directly and start running checks in our platform specifically. But if you have specific questions, you can also contact our sales team, sales@checker.com, for general questions. But if you want to look up me specifically, I'm on LinkedIn, Emily Farr. I'm based out of Oakland, California, and I would love to connect if anyone has questions or wants to share best practices. This is something that I've been passionate about for quite some time, so certainly reach out.
Yeah, I echo Em. In the second portion, at least, if you have any further questions, love to talk about it. You can find me on LinkedIn. But it's truly a blessing to be able to talk with your audience today, Abby, and we're just grateful for the time.
Well, it was so nice connecting with you guys, and I think everything we have talked about is so important, and it's one of those things that maybe can kind of get pushed to the wayside, and it's easy just like, oh, we'll deal with that eventually, or we'll revamp that part of our workflow eventually. But it really is urgent, it's imperative, and so I'm just so grateful to you guys and your passion for this entire subject. And thank you for sharing it with our community. And we have loved working with Checker. We're so glad to work with you guys, and also for everybody watching. We will be hearing more from Checker during our CHMS Summit, which is coming up in January. And so if you would like more details about that, you'd like to hear more from Checker and from some other CHMS professionals, visit chmssummit.com and you can get all the details. And we will list all of the Checker details in the comments as well. So thank you so much, guys, for being with us today.
Thanks, Abby.
Thanks, Abby.